Walter Grayson pointed his finger in her face in front of the entire staff and said, "You are no longer the right image for this establishment." 10 years. 10 years Elena Voss had carried that kitchen on her back, and this was everything she got in return. But what Walter didn't know was that the woman he just dismissed as invisible was the only reason anyone walked through his doors at all. And today, she was done being invisible. If you've ever given everything to someone who treated you like you were nothing, hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning it happened, Elena Voss was elbow-deep in bread dough when she heard Walter Grayson's footsteps on the kitchen stairs. She knew those footsteps. Everybody in the Blackridge Grand Inn knew them. The deliberate, heavy tread of a man who had never once in his life walked quietly into a room he owned. Walter moved through his property the way a boot moves through mud, with full expectation that everything beneath him would simply yield. Elena kept working. The dough needed another 4 minutes, and the breakfast crowd would arrive in less than an hour, and whatever Walter wanted could wait until her hands were clean. It couldn't wait. He pushed open the kitchen door without knocking. He never knocked, not in 10 years, and stopped in the center of the room with both hands on his lapels, looking at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's thinking about replacing. 2 of the kitchen girls were already at their stations. Young Martha was slicing potatoes. Old Cora was stirring something on the iron stove. They both went still the moment Walter walked in, the way animals go still when a larger animal enters their space. "Elena," Walter said. She turned around. Flour on her forearms, a smear of it across her jaw she didn't know was there. She looked at him and waited. "We need to talk about your position here." She wiped her hands on her apron. "What about it?" Walter cleared his throat. He wasn't an uncomfortable man by nature. He had fired people before, had cut wages before, had done 100 small cruelties without losing a minute of sleep. But something in Elena's steadiness always made him reach for words longer than he needed them. "The inn is changing," he said. "I'm making some adjustments to how we present ourselves to guests. More refined, more—" He gestured with one hand, vague and dismissive. "Modern." "Modern," Elena repeated. "You've done good work." He said it the way someone says the weather was fine, technically true, meaning nothing. But the face of this establishment needs to reflect a certain kind of image. The dining room, the service staff. I want things to look a particular way when guests walk through that door. Elena looked at him. "You want them to see someone younger." Walter's jaw tightened. "I want them to see someone who fits what I'm building." "I'm in the kitchen, Walter. Nobody sees me." "That's not entirely the point." She set down the bread scraper, carefully. It made a small, precise sound against the work table. "Then what is the point?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, at the stove, at the shelves lined with her spice jars, at the organized chaos of a kitchen that ran so smoothly it made other cooks furious with envy. He looked at all of it like he was inventorying something he already considered sold. "Effective next month," he said, "your role will be reduced. I'm bringing in someone new to manage kitchen operations. You'll assist." The word assist landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Martha's potato slicing stopped. Old Cora didn't turn around, but her stirring slowed almost to nothing. Elena stood very still. She had a particular quality when she was angry. Not the shaking, flushed kind of anger that made people loud, but the other kind, the kind that pulled everything inward and went cold and very quiet. And anyone who had known her for more than a season recognized it and was cautious around it. "You're making me the assistant," she said. "In my own kitchen." "It's my kitchen," Walter said. "Everything in this building is mine." 10 years. She had come to this inn at 23 years old with nothing but a willingness to work and a knowledge of food that she had built from the ground up, from watching her mother cook on a wood stove in a one-room house, from feeding her younger brothers when there was almost nothing to feed them with, from learning, through sheer repetition and failure and more repetition, how to turn cheap ingredients into something that made people close their eyes when they ate. She had built this kitchen's reputation from a 2-star roadside stop to the most talked-about dining room between here and the county seat. She had done that, not Walter. Walter had provided the building and the money and taken every ounce of credit. "All right," she said. Walter blinked. He had expected more resistance. "All right? I heard you." He waited another moment, looking for the argument he'd prepared himself for. When it didn't come, he straightened his coat, nodded once, and left. The kitchen door swung shut behind him. Old Cora finally turned from the stove. She was 60-something, gray-haired, and had worked in kitchens since before Elena was born, and she looked at Elena now with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warning. Something in between, the look of a woman who has seen this particular story play out before and knows how it ends. "You're not going to let that stand," Cora said. It wasn't a question. Elena picked up the bread scraper, went back to the dough. "Not a chance," she said quietly. "What?" She had known for a while that something was shifting in Walter Grayson, not just with her, with everything. Over the past several months, he had grown twitchy in a way that didn't fit him. Walter was a man who had built his entire personality around the appearance of control, and lately that appearance was developing cracks. He was canceling supplier orders and then reinstating them. He was holding meetings behind closed doors with men Elena didn't recognize. He was spending money in ways that didn't match the inn's ordinary operating pattern. New curtains in the dining room, a full repaint of the exterior, repairs on rooms that didn't need repairs. He was preparing the inn to be seen by someone. Elena had noticed because noticing was what she did. It was probably her most useful quality and the one that went most completely unacknowledged, the fact that she paid attention. To the ledger books when Walter left them open on the front desk. To the conversations that happened in the dining room while she moved between tables delivering food, invisible in the way service staff are invisible to the people they serve. To the small shifts in behavior that meant something was happening below the surface of a thing. She had learned this kind of attention partly from necessity. Growing up with little meant you learned to read your environment closely, to know before the bad thing happened that it was coming, and partly from 10 years of running a kitchen, which required the ability to hold 17 variables in your mind simultaneously and know which one was about to go wrong. What she was reading now, in Walter's behavior, said, "He is planning to sell." She didn't know to whom, she didn't know when, but the signs were there. The window dressing, the sudden interest in presentation, the way he was distancing himself from the day-to-day operation as though preparing to hand it to someone and walk away. The new arrangement, Elena reduced to assistant in her own kitchen, was probably part of that. Make the operation look like it ran on systems rather than on one woman's skill and muscle memory. Make it look transferable. Make it look like any reasonable new owner could step in and keep things running without her. She finished the bread, set it to rise, and began prepping for breakfast service without having to think about what came next. Her hands knew. After 10 years, they always knew. The man in the corner booth had been at the inn for 3 days. He had come in on a Thursday, paid for a week in advance with cash, real money, not a credit arrangement which Walter had noted with visible approval, and had spent most of his time sitting in the dining room eating his meals slowly and reading newspapers that he ordered with the mail. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet as a form of discipline rather than shyness. He spoke when spoken to, thanked the staff by name after the first day when he had learned their names, and left clean plates and a decent tip every meal. Elena had noticed him the way she noticed everything, catalogued and filed without particularly dwelling on it. Middle 40s, maybe edging toward 50. Weathered face that had seen a lot of sun and probably a lot of worse things than sun. Hands that didn't match the quiet way he held himself, scarred across the knuckles in the particular way that spoke of old violence, not farm work. He wore a jacket that covered his hip, but Elena had spent years watching how men sat and moved and weighted themselves, and she recognized the particular way he angled his body in a chair. He was armed, and he was watching. Not watching her specifically, watching the room, the door, the other guests, the street through the front window. Watching with the trained patience of a man who had spent years making a professional habit of it. On her third morning of quietly noticing him, she brought his coffee herself instead of sending Martha, and when she set the cup down, he looked up from his paper and thanked her, and she said, "You're not a salesman." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. No, he said, I'm not. You're not passing through either. Men passing through don't read week-old newspapers like they're looking for something specific. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, Nathan Crowell. I know who you are, she said, which wasn't entirely true. She knew the name, had heard it attached to various stories over the years, the way certain names acquire a gravity of their own in frontier communities. But she didn't know what he was doing in Blackridge Valley, and she suspected that knowing might matter. He studied her. You're the cook. I'm the cook. The food here is exceptional. I know. He almost smiled. Modest. Just accurate, she said, and went back to the kitchen. The man Walter had brought in to replace her was named Gus Pendleton, and he arrived on a Tuesday with a carpet bag and an attitude of supreme self-confidence that Elena recognized immediately as the kind built on very little actual experience. He was 26, maybe 27, with clean hands and a way of standing in doorways that suggested he expected people to move around him rather than the other way around. Walter introduced him as the inn's new kitchen manager, with the same energy he might have used to announce a new piece of dining room furniture. Gus shook Elena's hand with 2 fingers, which told her everything. Walter speaks highly of your work, Gus said, looking around the kitchen with the evaluating squint of someone who had read about kitchens in a book. I'm sure we can find ways to use your experience. Elena said, I'm thinking we modernize the menu. Some of these dishes are, he waved a hand, traditional. The guests like them. Guests like what they're given, Gus said. It's the job of management to guide taste. Old Cora, at the stove, made a sound that might have been a cough. Elena spent that first day watching Gus run the kitchen. It was illuminating in the way watching a confident person make a series of entirely avoidable mistakes is illuminating, painful, a little fascinating, difficult to look away from. He oversalted the soup. He pulled the roast 40 minutes too early. He reorganized the prep station in a way that made the afternoon workflow significantly less efficient. And when Elena mentioned this, carefully and without obvious judgment, he told her that he appreciated her input and would take it under consideration. He did not take it under consideration. By the time the evening service was done, 2 tables had complained about their food, and old Cora had said 3 words total, all of them to Elena, and none of them repeatable in polite company. Elena cleaned her station and went home. She had a small room in a boarding house 2 blocks from the inn, a single bed, a window that faced an alley, a writing desk where she kept her accounts and her lists. She sat at the desk that night and did not sleep for a long time. She had worked in other people's houses her whole life, cooked in other people's kitchens, built things in spaces that weren't hers, and watched other people take credit for what she'd built. She had told herself, for years, that this was simply the nature of things, the shape of the world she had been born into, and that stability was worth more than pride. But something Walter had said kept circling back to her. It's my kitchen. Everything in this building is mine. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Victor Raines arrived in Blackridge Valley on a Friday morning in early October, and the first thing Elena noticed about him was that he smiled too quickly. It was a small observation, the kind she might not have been able to articulate to someone else if asked to explain it, just that his smile appeared before it should have, a fraction of a second before his eyes had finished reading whatever he was looking at, like a reflex rather than a response, like something practiced until it looked natural but hadn't quite gotten there. He came into the inn's dining room for breakfast and ordered the full plate, and ate it with the appreciative unhurry of a man who understood that being seen to enjoy a thing was a form of currency. He complimented the food through the serving girl in a way that was clearly intended to reach the kitchen. He tipped generously enough that Martha came back to tell Elena about it. Charming, Elena said, without looking up from the sauce she was reducing. He's very well dressed, Martha offered. People with money to steal usually are. Martha blinked. What? Nothing. Go check table 4. She didn't know, not yet, what Victor Raines was. But she had been watching Walter, and the way Walter behaved when Victor came in, the particular quality of his attention, the carefully managed casualness of a man trying not to show that he was hoping for something, told Elena that this was the meeting Walter had been preparing for. This was the buyer. Later that afternoon, she saw Nathan Crowell watching Victor from his usual corner table. His newspaper was open, but his eyes were not on it. That evening, when the dining room had emptied and she was the last one in the kitchen, she heard footsteps on the stairs and expected Walter. It was Nathan. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, an odd gesture, polite, almost formal, and said, "Do you have a few minutes?" She looked at him. "I have until the bread for tomorrow is ready." He came in and sat at the work table without being invited, which she noted and didn't object to. "The man who came in today," he said. "Victor Rains." "I know." "You recognized him." "I recognized the type." "What is he?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before he said something he had decided needed to be said carefully. "He's done this before. 3 towns that I know of. He comes in presenting himself as an investor, legitimate capital, willing to pay fair prices. He identifies landowners or business owners who are in some kind of difficulty. Financial trouble, age, dispute with a partner, whatever the weak point is. Then he offers to help. And the help turns out to be a trap. His contracts have clauses that most people don't catch, terms that shift ownership under conditions that seem unlikely but aren't. He's been careful. Never anything a court could easily untangle. By the time people understand what happened, the property is his, and the original owner is holding paper that's worth considerably less than what they were promised. Elena reduced the heat on the stove. "Who are his targets here?" "Walter Grayson is one. I think he's already in conversation with 2 of the ranch owners on the north side of the valley." He paused. "And I think Rains is planning something larger, not just individual properties, the whole commercial corridor." She was quiet, processing this. Then, "You came to tell me this because?" Nathan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Because you pay attention," he said. "And because if Rains takes what he's planning to take, you lose your position, your income, and your reputation, everything you've built here. And I don't think that's acceptable." "You don't know me well enough to know what's acceptable to me." "No," he said. "But I know what I've watched you do for 3 days, and I know that you already figured out most of what I just told you before I said it." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working at the kitchen window, that particular late October sound that meant winter was deciding whether to arrive. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked. "I'm going to gather evidence, but evidence needs someone who understands how the business records in this town actually work. The accounts, the supply chains, the property arrangements." He held her gaze. "You know those things." "I'm a cook. You're the person who has managed the operational accounts of this inn for 10 years because Walter can't add 3 numbers without making an error, and you've never once been given credit for it." She looked away, went back to the bread. "I'll think about it," she said. It was as close to yes as she was going to give him that night, and somehow he understood that, because he put his hat back on and said good night and left without pushing. She had not planned, when she lay in her bed that night staring at the ceiling, to feel anything other than the cold, practical calculation of someone making a business decision. She had not planned to feel the particular sore quality of being seen by someone, not wanted, not complimented, but seen, after a very long time of being invisible. It was inconvenient. She pushed it aside, but she got up before dawn and walked to the ink-dark end of Frontier Avenue and stood in front of the abandoned Harmon building, which had sat empty for 4 years since old Joel Harmon died without heirs, and she looked at it for a long time. It was not pretty. The sign had fallen, and the front window had a crack running bottom corner to top center, and the door needed a new hinge. But the bones were good. She could see that even in the thin pre-dawn light. Big open ground floor, 2 high windows on either side for ventilation, a back room that could be converted to a kitchen without enormous difficulty. She had looked at this building before. She had walked past it every morning for 2 years and looked at it the way you look at something you want and don't let yourself want. She was 33 years old. She had $112 saved in a tin box under her bed. Every cent she had managed to hold on to over 10 years of very careful living. She had a reputation in this town that Walter Grayson had tried to take credit for and hadn't entirely succeeded in taking. She had the trust of every supplier between here and the county seat, because she was the one who actually placed the orders and paid the invoices and never once left a debt unpaid. What she did not have was a safety net. If she failed, she lost everything and started from nothing, and she was not 23 anymore. The wind came down Frontier Avenue and hit her face, cold and direct, and she stood in it and felt afraid. Genuinely, specifically afraid, not the vague background anxiety of an uncertain life, but the sharp fear of a person standing at the edge of something real. She stood in it anyway. Then she went back to the inn and started breakfast service because there were guests to feed, and she was still, for the time being, the person responsible for feeding them. But she had begun to understand what came next. When she walked past Nathan's corner table that morning with the coffee pot, she refilled his cup without being asked, and when he looked up, she said very quietly, "The Harmon Building. Do you know who holds the lease?" He looked at her. That small recalibration in his expression, the one she was beginning to recognize. "I can find out by this afternoon." "Do that," she said, and moved on to the next table. Behind her, she didn't see him almost smile. But he did. Nathan had the lease information by 2 in the afternoon. He came into the kitchen during the quiet hour between lunch and dinner preparation, when the inn was at its stillest and Elena was working through the accounts she technically wasn't supposed to be managing anymore. Gus had been given that responsibility along with everything else. But Gus had looked at the supply ledger on his second day, said, "This seems fine," and never opened it again, which meant Elena was still doing it, just without the acknowledgement. Nathan set a folded piece of paper on the corner of her work table without interrupting what she was doing, and she finished the column she was adding before she picked it up. The Harmon Building was held by the county land office under an inactive lease arrangement. Joel Harmon had paid a 20-year term in advance back in '68, which meant there were still 4 years of paid tenancy sitting unclaimed on the county's books. Any party could petition to assume the remaining term for administrative costs only, provided no other party had filed a prior claim. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Nathan. "Nobody's claimed it in 4 years," she said. "Nobody's wanted it. Victor Raines will want it the moment he understands what it is." "Yes," Nathan said, "which is why the question is whether you file before he identifies it." She was quiet. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, the kind of October light that made everything look older than it was. She thought about the $112 in the tin box. She thought about the crack in the front window of the Harmon Building and the door that needed a new hinge. "The administrative cost," she said. "Do you know what it is?" $60. County processing fee. $60 was more than half of everything she had. If she spent it, she would have $52 left to open and operate a business from nothing, in a building that needed work, in a town that was currently being circled by a man whose entire method depended on people not having enough of a financial cushion to fight back. "I need 3 days," she said. Nathan nodded and took back the paper without asking what the 3 days were for. She appreciated that. She had encountered, over the years, a particular kind of man who responded to a woman saying, "I need time to think," by explaining why she didn't actually need that much time. Nathan was not that kind of man, which she found both useful and in a way she wasn't ready to examine. Quietly remarkable. She spent the first of those 3 days doing something she hadn't done in years. She asked for help. It wasn't easy. Elena had a complicated relationship with asking, had developed it over a lifetime of being in situations where asking meant exposing a weakness that someone else might exploit, where needing something gave other people leverage over you. She had learned, early and thoroughly, that self-sufficiency was safer than dependence, and she had run her entire life on that principle with enough success to make it feel like wisdom rather than scar tissue. But she was 33 years old, and she had $52, and she needed more than that to do what she was thinking about doing, and pride was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. The first person she went to was Margaret Oakes. Margaret ran the dry goods store on the east end of Frontier Avenue, had run it for 11 years since her husband died and left her the business and the debt that went with it, and had turned it from a failing operation into the most reliable supply source in the valley through a combination of stubbornness, sharp arithmetic, and the particular brand of social intelligence that women who get underestimated for long enough tend to develop as a survival skill. She was 51 years old, wide through the shoulders, and had never once in Elena's memory pretended to be anything other than exactly what she was. Elena came in 20 minutes before closing, waited until the last customer left, and then said, without preamble, I'm going to open a restaurant. I need $20 as a short-term loan, and I'll repay it in 4 months with interest." Margaret looked at her for a long, assessing moment. "What happened at the inn?" "Walter's replacing me."
"With that boy who's been burning the soup?" "Yes?" Margaret was quiet. Then she went to the back room and came back with $23 in a small envelope. "The extra 3 is because I've been meaning to give you something for years and never found the right occasion," she said. "Don't argue with me about it." Elena didn't argue. She said thank you, which cost her something, and Margaret waved her off with the practiced impatience of a woman who found gratitude uncomfortable. The second person was Dale Kaufman, who ran the feed and grain operation on the South Road and had been a reliable supplier to the inn for 8 years. Dale was the kind of man who said very little and meant all of it, and when Elena explained what she was planning, he sat with it for a full minute before he said, "You'd need a commercial account." "Yes. I can extend 60 days on a commercial account to a new business with an established operator." "I'm the established operator." "I know who you are, Elena." He said it without any particular emphasis, just a statement of fact, but it landed differently than Walter's dismissals had. He knew who she was because he had dealt with her for years, because she was the one who placed the orders and managed the deliveries and never once sent back a bad invoice without a clear explanation. He knew her not as the person behind the kitchen door, but as the person who ran the operation. 60 days, he said again. "We'll work out the terms when you've got the lease in hand." She walked home that evening with Margaret's envelope in her coat pocket and the first real sense, in a very long time, that something was possible. On the second day, she told Gus Pendleton that the spice inventory was critically low and that he needed to place an emergency order with 3 specific suppliers. This was not true. The spice inventory was fine. She had checked it herself the previous morning. What she needed was for Gus to spend the afternoon dealing with suppliers. Specifically, she needed him occupied and away from the kitchen accounts, so that she could pull the original supply contracts from the back filing cabinet and make copies of the key clauses before Walter had a chance to move them somewhere she couldn't access. Gus believed her about the spice inventory because he had not once checked the inventory himself, and he left for the supplier district with the self-important energy of a man doing important management work. And Elena spent the next 3 hours at the kitchen table with the filing cabinet open and her handwriting moving fast across fresh paper. She wasn't sure yet exactly what she was looking for. But Nathan had said Victor's strength was in the documents, in clauses that seemed innocuous but weren't, in terms that shifted meaning under specific conditions. And if Victor was targeting Walter, and Walter was the inn's owner, then the contracts Walter held were going to matter. The supply agreements, the property arrangements, any existing liens or encumbrances on the building. What she found, buried in a contract dated 14 months ago, was a provision she had to read 4 times before she was certain she understood it correctly. Walter had borrowed money, a significant amount, more than Elena had known about, more than the inn's ordinary operation would have required. The lender was listed as a company called Meridian Capital Holdings, which she didn't recognize. The terms included a clause she had seen versions of before in other agreements, a standard-looking provision about right of first refusal in the event of property sale or change of ownership. Standard-looking. She read it again, slowly, the way she had taught herself to read documents, not for what they said, but for what they assumed, for the places where the language went slightly vague and the vagueness was doing work. The right of first refusal extended not just to Walter's property, but to any business operating within the property, which meant any new business established in the building, which meant that if Walter sold the inn to anyone, the lender had the right to step in and assume the terms before the sale closed. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. Meridian Capital Holdings. She wrote the name down 3 times on a separate piece of paper, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket with Margaret's envelope. Nathan was not at his usual corner table for dinner that evening, and she noticed his absence the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making a point of it to herself, filed somewhere in the back of her mind alongside everything else she was tracking. He came to the kitchen door at 8:30, after service, with mud on his boots that said he had been somewhere outside of town. His expression was the same as always, composed, difficult to read, but there was something underneath it that she was beginning to learn to recognize,
a slight tightening around the eyes that meant he had found something he wasn't happy about. Meridian Capital Holdings, she said, before he could speak. He stopped. Where did you get that name? Walter's loan documents. Filed 14 months ago. She handed him the folded paper. The right of first refusal clause. It's written to cover any business in the building, not just Walter's original operation. Nathan read the paper. Once, then again, his jaw did something tight. This is Victor's, he said. Meridian is one of his shell companies. I've seen it before. Different state, different name on the registration, but the same structure. He lent Walter the money 14 months ago, which means he's been planning this for over a year. Nathan folded the paper and looked at her. He didn't just arrive here looking for an opportunity. He created the conditions. She had already understood this. Hearing it said out loud by someone else made it feel more real and more infuriating. Walter doesn't know? Walter knows he borrowed money from a company. He doesn't know who owns the company. She thought about Walter, about the twitchy, over-controlled quality she had noticed in him over the past months, the way he was preparing the inn for a sale that he seemed to believe was his idea. Victor had not come to Blackridge Valley and found a man in trouble. Victor had found a man, created the trouble, and then arrived to offer the solution. It was elegant, in the way that a trap is elegant. Simple, patient, invisible until it was already too late. He's going to do the same to the ranch owners, she said. Probably already has. We need to see their loan agreements. They won't show a stranger their loan papers. No, Nathan agreed, but they might show you. The third day was the hardest. She had spent 10 years being careful. Careful with money, careful with words, careful about what she asked for and from whom, careful to keep her ambitions modest enough that losing them wouldn't break her. Caution had kept her fed and housed and employed. Caution was the reason she still had $135. She had counted it again after Margaret's envelope, instead of nothing. She filed the petition for the Harmon Building lease at the county land office at 9 in the morning, paid the $60 in cash, and walked out with a receipt that had her name on it. Elena Voss, petitioner. She stood on the county office steps and looked at the paper and felt something strange. Not triumph, which she had expected, but something more fragile. A kind of exposure, as though she had just stepped out from behind a wall she had built for herself over many years and was standing in the open for the first time, and the open was larger than she'd remembered. She folded the receipt, put it in her pocket, and went back to work. Gus lasted another week before he broke the kitchen. Not literally. No fires, no structural damage. But on the second Thursday of his management, the inn's lunch service descended into a quiet disaster that the dining room staff handled with the tight-faced professionalism of people who knew the food was wrong but were too polite to say so to the guests. The soup was thin. The bread hadn't proofed properly. The roast was overcooked at the edges and cold in the center in the specific way that meant the oven temperature had been wrong for hours without anyone catching it. Elena watched it happen from her position at the prep station, her reduced assistant position, with the controlled expression of someone who has made a decision not to intervene, because intervening was no longer her job, and also because part of her, a part she wasn't proud of, wanted the room to understand what it was losing. That was the human part of her, the petty part. She acknowledged it and didn't pretend it wasn't there. After service, when Gus was in Walter's office presumably explaining the lunch situation in terms that minimized his own role in it, old Cora sat down across from Elena at the work table and said, "You filing for that Harmon building?" Elena looked at her. "How do you know about that?" Margaret Oakes told the butcher, and the butcher told the feed store man, and the feed store man told the woman who does the laundry for the inn, and she told me. Cora shrugged with the magnificent indifference of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by the speed of small-town information. "You need a cook." "I need everything." "You need a cook first. Everything else you can figure out. You need someone who can be there from the beginning and who already knows how you run a kitchen." Cora looked at her with the flat directness of a woman who had long since stopped dressing things up. "I'm 63 years old, and my knees hurt, and I'm not going to work for that boy when you leave." "So," Elena was quiet for a moment, "I can't pay you what Walter pays you.
Not at first. Walter doesn't pay me enough either, which is apparently something we've both been putting up with for too long. Cora folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking for a charity arrangement. I'm asking for fair wages when you can manage fair wages, and something worth doing in the meantime. Elena looked at her. At this woman who had been part of the background of her working life for 6 years, who she had taken somewhat for granted the way you take for granted the things that are always there, always reliable. It occurred to her that Cora was doing the same thing she was doing, reassessing what she was worth and who deserved to benefit from it. All right, Elena said. Yes. Cora nodded once, with the satisfied expression of a practical decision properly made, and got up to start prep for the evening service, as though the conversation had simply been the obvious next step in a sequence they had both seen coming. Victor Raines had dinner at the inn every evening. He had made it something of a ritual. The corner table near the window, a glass of the inn's better wine, unhurried. He spoke pleasantly with the staff and read the room with the easy attention of a man who had learned to make surveillance look like sociability. Elena watched him the way she watched everything, without appearing to watch at all. On the Thursday of the bad lunch service, Victor had been in a meeting with Walter that lasted well into the afternoon. She had heard their voices through the office wall while she was cleaning the prep station. Not the words, just the tone, and the tone was the particular one of a negotiation reaching its later stages, where both parties are performing more confidence than they feel. After dinner that evening, Victor stopped at the kitchen doorway on his way out. It was the first time he had done this. He was immaculately dressed, as always, and he smiled with that slight ahead-of-itself quality. "Remarkable meal," he said, "the venison especially." "I'll pass that on," Elena said. "You're the original cook here, aren't you? Before the new arrangement." She looked at him. "I'm the cook," she said, same word she had used with Nathan. Different weight to them. "I understand you've been with the inn for some time. That kind of institutional knowledge is valuable." He said it smoothly, pleasantly, in the tone of a man making a compliment. "I do hope whatever transitions happen here allow for the right people to continue doing good work." It was a remarkably well-constructed sentence. It acknowledged that transitions were coming, told her that he knew she knew, without confirming anything specific. It positioned him as sympathetic to her situation, and it was right she recognized a soft probe. He was checking whether she was the kind of person who could be managed with a kind word and a vague reassurance. "Thank you," she said, with the same smooth pleasantness. "Good night." He left. She went back to the dishes. A few minutes later, she heard Nathan's footsteps on the stairs. She was beginning to learn his particular pattern, heavier on the left foot, and he appeared in the doorway. "He talked to you," Nathan said. Not a question. He was being reassuring, which means he's assessed me as a potential complication. "Are you a complication?" She handed him the copy of the lease receipt from her coat pocket. He read it, and the tightening around his eyes became something else. Something that might, on a less contained face, have been satisfaction. "When do you take possession?" he asked. 2 weeks. I need to be out of the inn before then." "Walter hasn't formally ended your employment." "He will. Once Victor's deal closes, the first thing a new owner does is clear out anyone who knew the old operation well enough to ask uncomfortable questions." She took the receipt back, folded it along the same crease. "I'm not waiting to be cleared out." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had returned. It had been doing that all week, building and dropping, as though it hadn't yet committed to being winter. "I'm going to need your help with the ranchers," he said. "Specifically, Tom Burley on the North Road. He won't talk to me." "Tom Burley doesn't trust anyone who wasn't born in this valley." "Were you?" "No, but I've fed his family for 8 years, and I know his wife takes cream in her coffee, and his youngest daughter is allergic to walnuts." She paused. "That's worth more than birthright out here." Nathan almost smiled again. She was starting to think that almost smile was as far as it went with him. A perpetual almost. Something held just short of the surface. "I'll set up a meeting," she said. She went back to the dishes, and he went back to whatever it was he did in the evenings in his room, and neither of them said anything further that night. But the shape of what they were doing together had clarified in a way it hadn't been before, and Elena felt it the way you feel a shift in weather,
Not yet visible, but definite, already in motion. She gave Walter her notice on a Friday morning. She had thought about how to do this, had run various versions of it through her mind over the past week, different tones, different levels of formality. She had considered being cold, which would have been satisfying. She had considered being dignified, which was probably more accurate to who she was. She had settled, in the end, on simply being direct. Walter was in his office when she knocked. He looked up with the vaguely guilty expression he had developed around her since the Gus situation. A man who knew he had made a poor decision and was hoping it would quietly resolve itself without anyone having to say so out loud. "I'm leaving the inn," she said. 2 weeks' notice, as agreed when I was hired. I'll stay through the 15th. Walter blinked. "Elena, I've secured other arrangements." She didn't say what they were. It wasn't his business yet, and she preferred to let the town find out in its own time rather than give Walter information he might feel compelled to share with Victor. Walter was quiet for a long moment. He looked, for the first time in her memory, genuinely uncomfortable. Not the defensive discomfort of a man being challenged, but the softer, harder to manage discomfort of a man who has done something he knows is wrong and is watching the consequence of it walk out of his office. "You've been invaluable here," he said. It came out stiffly, like something he had rehearsed and didn't quite believe. "I know," Elena said. "Good morning, Walter." She closed the door behind her, walked back through the dining room, and stood for a moment at the kitchen door with her hand on the frame, looking at the room she had spent 10 years making into something worth being proud of. Then she went in and started lunch prep because there was food to be made and guests to feed, and she was still, for 2 more weeks, the person responsible for all of it. Old Cora was already at the stove. She didn't look up, but she said, "How'd he take it?" "Fine," Elena said. "He looked guilty?" "Yes." "Good," Cora said, and reached for the salt. The Harmon building smelled like old wood and settled dust, and something underneath both of those things that Elena couldn't name but recognized. The particular smell of a space that had been useful once and was waiting to be useful again. She stood in the center of the empty ground floor on the morning she took possession and looked at everything that needed doing. The list was long. The crack in the front window was worse up close than it had looked from the street. The glass would need to go, not just be patched. The floorboards near the back wall had softened from moisture that had come in through a gap in the foundation seal. The back room that she intended to convert to her kitchen had the remnants of Joel Harmon's old dry storage operation, rusted shelving, broken crates, a smell of old grain that would take serious scrubbing to get out. She had $75 left. 60 for the lease filing, 20 from Margaret's envelope, minus the supplies she had already purchased for the window, plus the 52 from the tin box. She had a commercial account at Dale Kaufman's Feed and Grain, 60 days of credit, and Cora's agreement to work through the opening period on deferred wages. She also had, she was beginning to understand, something harder to quantify. The particular kind of social capital that accumulates slowly and invisibly over years of doing good work for people who remember it. By the end of that first day in the Harmon building, without Elena having specifically asked, 3 things happened. Margaret Oakes sent her nephew over with tools and 2 hours of carpentry work at no charge. The blacksmith from the east end of Frontier Avenue appeared with a new hinge for the front door and installed it himself, saying that he'd eaten at the inn every Thursday for 6 years and intended to transfer that habit to wherever Elena was cooking. And Tom Burley's wife, Ruth, came by with a jar of her preserved peaches and an offer to help clean, which she did, for 4 hours, talking the entire time about everything except what was clearly the reason she'd come. It was Ruth who finally said it, near the end of the afternoon on her knees scrubbing the backroom floor. "Tom had a meeting with that Rains man last week." Elena kept working. "How did it go?" "Tom didn't tell me exactly. He told me it went fine." Ruth's scrubbing slowed. "Tom tells me things went fine when he doesn't want me to worry. Which means it didn't go fine." Elena sat back on her heels and looked at Ruth Burley, a woman in her mid-40s who had been running a household and helping manage a ranch for 22 years, and who knew the difference between fine and fine as well as anyone. "Do you know if Tom signed anything?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "There's a paper in his desk that he hasn't told me about. I haven't read it. I don't read his papers without being asked." She paused. "But I noticed it." I'd like to talk to Tom, Elena said. Not Nathan, just me. Would that be all right? Ruth looked at her with an expression that combined relief and resignation in equal measure. Come for supper Thursday, she said. I'll make sure he's there. Nathan, when Elena told him about the Thursday supper invitation, said, Good. They were in the back room of the Harmon building. Her room now. She was getting used to thinking of it that way, going through a set of documents he had obtained from the county recorder's office, public filings, all of it, information that anyone could have accessed, but that most people never thought to look at and wouldn't have known what they were seeing if they did. What they were seeing, spread across the work table that Elena had salvaged from the old storage shelving, was the shape of what Victor Raines had been building in Blackridge Valley over the past 14 months. It was, even to Elena who had suspected it, larger than she'd imagined. 3 separate loan agreements, Walter's being the one she already knew about, all through Meridian Capital Holdings, all containing the same right of first refusal language, all written to reach maturity within a 6-month window that was now approximately 8 weeks away. 2 property purchase inquiries filed with the county that listed a second company name she hadn't seen before, Cascade River Development. The same structure Nathan had described, different name, same handwriting behind it. A survey filing on the commercial corridor of Frontier Avenue, not a purchase, just a survey, the kind a buyer commissions before making an offer, that covered 7 properties including the Harmon building. He had surveyed the Harmon building. He had surveyed it 3 months ago, which meant that when Elena had been standing in front of it in the pre-dawn dark thinking about wanting it, Victor Raines had already sent a man to measure it. He was going to take this building, she said. Not a question. Eventually, the survey was probably preliminary, getting a sense of what the corridor was worth as a package. Your filing would have jumped ahead of any purchase claim he made, but only because you filed first. Nathan looked at the papers. If you'd waited another 2 or 3 weeks, he'd have moved. She thought about the morning she had stood at the county office steps with the receipt in her hand, feeling exposed. She had almost waited. She had sat with the decision for 3 days, and at any point in those 3 days she could have talked herself out of it. And if she had, this building would have become another piece of what Victor was assembling. The survey covers the whole corridor, she said. He doesn't just want the inn and the ranches. He wants the town, Nathan said, or enough of it to control the rest. If he holds the commercial properties and the major ranch land, he controls the supply chain, the commerce, the tax base, everything that matters. He paused. It's the same pattern as before. He doesn't buy towns. He absorbs them. Elena looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she said, We need more than the loan documents. We need to show that Meridian and Cascade River are the same operation. I know. And we need to show that the right of first refusal clause was designed to be triggered, that he wrote it knowing the conditions would occur. That requires someone who understands contract law. There's a lawyer in Harlan Creek, Agnes Fowler. She handled the Harmon estate when Joel died, which is why the building ended up in county holding the way it did. She's sharp, and she doesn't like being on the losing side of things. Elena had met Agnes Fowler twice, both times in connection with supply agreements she'd negotiated for the inn. She had come away both times with the impression of a woman who treated every contract the way Elena treated a recipe, as something that needed to be executed precisely or not at all. She'd see it. Can you get to Harlan Creek? I can take the Friday coach. Be back Saturday evening. She looked at him. Can you keep watching Raines while I'm gone? That's what I've been doing. He said it without emphasis, just a statement of fact. But she heard something in it, a kind of quiet steadiness that she had stopped taking for granted over the past 2 weeks. Nathan Crowell had no obvious stake in Blackridge Valley. He was here on his own time, spending his own money, doing this because he had decided it needed doing. She had not asked him why. She was not sure she was ready to ask or ready to hear the answer. She went to see Tom Burley on Thursday evening as arranged. The Burley Ranch was 8 miles north of town, far enough that she had borrowed Margaret Oak's horse for the ride and arrived with her coat dusty and her mood somewhere between determined and privately anxious in a way she didn't let reach her face. Ruth met her at the door with the peach preserves opened and biscuits already on the table, which said something about how the household had been doing since Victor's visit. Tom Burley was a man of 53 who looked like he had been made for outdoor work and worn down by 20 years of it. Broad through the chest, hands that were larger than they needed to be, a face that had stopped being readable when he was about 30 and just stayed that way. He shook Elena's hand the way he'd shake a man's hand, which she had always appreciated, and said it was good of her to come, which was as warm as Tom got with anyone. They ate first, because that was how you did things at the Burley table, and the meal was good, and Elena was careful not to compliment the food too specifically because Ruth would deflect it and Tom would mistake it for performance. She talked about the Harmon building, about what she was planning, about Cora coming with her. She let the conversation find its own pace. It was over the second cup of coffee that Tom said, without any particular transition, "I guess you know something about that Raines fellow." "Some," Elena said. "He came out here about 3 weeks ago. Came introduced by Walter Grayson, which I took as a recommendation because Walter and I have done business for 15 years and he's never steered me wrong on anything important." Tom turned his coffee cup in his hands. A slow rotation, like something he did when he was thinking. Raines had a proposal, investment capital for the North Range expansion I've been trying to do for 2 years. Good terms on the surface, longer loan window than the county bank offered, lower interest rate. "Did you sign?" Tom was quiet. Ruth was looking at her coffee. "I signed a letter of intent," Tom said, "not the full agreement. He said the full agreement would follow in 30 days with the final terms locked in." He paused. "The letter of intent had a confidentiality clause, which is why I didn't mention it to Ruth when I should have." Ruth didn't look up. Elena kept her voice even. "Tom, I need to tell you something about Meridian Capital Holdings, which is the company Victor Raines uses for these arrangements, and I need you to listen to all of it before you decide how you feel about it," she told him. Not everything, not the full scope of what she and Nathan had found, not the survey filing or the larger plan, not yet, but enough. The loan structure, the right of first refusal clause, the other 2 properties already entangled in the same arrangement, the pattern from the other towns. Tom listened with the particular stillness of a man hearing something he has been afraid to hear confirmed. His jaw went tight about halfway through and stayed that way. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that Ruth finally looked up and looked at him. "The letter of intent," he said. "Does it bind me to the final agreement?" "That depends on what the letter says. I need to see it." Another silence. Then Tom pushed back from the table, went to the small room off the kitchen that served as his office, and came back with a folded document that he set on the table in front of Elena. She read it carefully. It took her several minutes, and she read it twice, because the language was dense in the particular way that Victor's documents were dense, each readable on the surface, doing something else underneath. When she looked up, both Tom and Ruth were watching her. "The letter binds you to enter into good faith negotiation," she said. "It does not bind you to the final terms, and there's a clause here." She pointed to a paragraph near the end, small print, exactly where Victor would put the thing he wanted overlooked. It says the negotiation period expires if either party fails to respond to communications within 14 days. Tom frowned. "Meaning what?" "Meaning if he sends you a letter and you don't respond within 2 weeks, the letter of intent lapses and you owe him nothing." She looked at him directly. "Have you heard from him since he came out here?" "Got a letter 10 days ago. I haven't answered it." 4 days. She looked at him, and he looked back, and she watched the arithmetic register on his face, the tight jaw going a fraction tighter, then releasing, the way a man looks when he realizes he has been 4 days away from something he doesn't want to think about. "Don't answer it," she said. "Let it lapse." Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's doing this to Walter." "Yes." "And to who else on the North Road?" She told him. She watched his expression move through something complicated, anger, and under it something that looked like shame, and under that something harder and more durable. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "For now, just your letter of intent, and the names of anyone else out here who Raines has approached." She paused. "And your word that you'll talk to them before he does." Tom Burley looked at his wife, and Ruth looked back at him, and something passed between them that was quieter and more complete than anything that needed words. "You'll have it," he said. Agnes Fowler's office in Harlan Creek was on the second floor of a building that had started as a mercantile and evolved over 30 years into something that housed a law practice, a surveyor's equipment storage, and what appeared to be an ongoing and unresolved dispute between Agnes and the surveyor about whose boxes were whose. It had the cluttered, purposeful energy of a space that was used hard and organized only to the degree necessary. Agnes herself was 60 or thereabouts, with silver hair cut practically short and the kind of attention behind her eyes that made you feel when she looked at you, as though she was reading you the way she read a document, for what you were actually saying rather than what you appeared to be saying. She listened to Elena without interrupting, which Elena had not expected and appreciated deeply. She looked at the copies of the Meridian documents, the right of first refusal language, the survey filing, the two company names. When Elena finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have the county filing date on your lease?" "Yes." "And you have copies of all 3 loan agreements?" "The originals are county record. These are my copies." Agnes picked up the Meridian contract with the right of first refusal clause and read the relevant paragraph twice. Her expression didn't change much, just a slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind of focus that concentrated rather than revealed. "This clause," she said, is written to trigger on sale or transfer of operational control, not just on sale." "I saw that." "Which means that Walter Grayson's arrangement with this new manager, the one taking over kitchen operations, could be read as a transfer of operational control of the inn's primary revenue-generating function." Elena had seen this too, had seen it without knowing quite what to do with it. Hearing Agnes say it made the implication sharper. Victor could claim the right of first refusal has already been triggered. He could try. Whether it would hold in a proper proceeding is another question. The language is aggressive, but it's not unambiguous. Agnes set the paper down. "He writes these to intimidate, not necessarily to litigate. Most of his targets don't get as far as actual litigation because by the time they understand what's in the document, they believe they can't afford to fight it." She looked at Elena. "Can you get me the second company registration? The Cascade River filing?" "Nathan Crowell is working on that. He has contacts with the county recorder in 2 other states where Victor has operated." Agnes's expression shifted slightly. "Nathan Crowell is involved in this?" "Yes, I know that name." She said it neutrally, without the weight that name sometimes carried in certain circles. The weight of bad history, of violence, of reputation as both asset and liability. "All right. Get me the Cascade River registration and anything else Crowell can pull from the other counties. If we can establish that Meridian and Cascade River are the same beneficial owner, the whole structure starts to look like coordinated fraud rather than aggressive investment, and that's a different kind of conversation." She paused. "I'll need 2 weeks." "We may not have 2 weeks. The loan maturities, I know about loan maturities. 2 weeks. Agnes looked at her with the flat directness of someone who has been in rooms full of urgency and learned to move at the speed that produces accuracy rather than the speed that produces errors. "The work I do in 2 weeks will be worth more than what I could do in 4 days, and you need it to be worth something." Elena looked at her. "What will this cost?" Agnes picked up her pen. "Come back with the Cascade River registration and we'll talk about cost." It was, Elena recognized, not an answer, but it was also not a no, and sometimes that was the best available thing. She was back in Blackridge Valley by Saturday evening, and by Sunday morning everything had shifted. Victor Raines had made his move while she was gone. Nathan met her at the Harmon building before she'd had time to take her coat off, and his expression had the tight quality she'd learned to read as something more urgent than his ordinary watchfulness. He approached Dale Kaufman, Nathan said, Friday afternoon. Made an offer on the feed and grain building. Not the business, just the property. Framed it as a straightforward commercial sale at a fair price. Elena's stomach went cold. Dale's building. Her 60-day commercial account. Did Dale sign anything? No. Dale told him he'd think about it and told me about it 2 hours later. Nathan paused. But Raines also went to see the Hendersons at the dry goods west of here, and the widow Marsh who owns the laundry building, both in the same day. 3 properties in one Friday. Victor had stopped being patient. He knows someone is looking at his documents, Elena said. Almost certainly. He has enough contacts in this town that it wouldn't take long for him to hear that questions were being asked at the county recorder's office. Nathan looked at her steadily. He's accelerating. She took off her coat and hung it on the nail by the door that she had put there on her second day in the building, establishing the small habits of a place that was hers. Her mind was moving fast, sorting and prioritizing with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to a complicated service when three things were going wrong at once. Then we accelerate, she said. What does that mean? It means we stop gathering information and start using it. She looked at him. How close are you to the Cascade River registration? I have a contact in Oregon who can have it to me by Wednesday. Get it to Agnes Fowler in Harlan Creek by Thursday. She needs 2 weeks. We give her 9 days and we ask nicely. She moved to the work table where the documents were still spread from their last session. Tom Burley is talking to the other ranchers. Dale Kaufman, we already have. I need to go see the Henderson family and the widow Marsh today. They don't know you the way Dale does. They know who I am. Everyone in this valley knows who I am. They've been eating my food for 10 years. She said it without vanity, just precision. That's not nothing. Nathan was quiet for a moment, then, Victor is going to find out about the Harmon building filing, if he hasn't already. He may already know. The county filings are public. If he knows you hold the lease, he'll understand that you're the one asking questions. He'll move against you specifically. She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, not warning exactly, more like the statement of a man who is calculating risk on behalf of someone else and finding the number higher than he's comfortable with. I know, she said. I'm not sure you know what that looks like in practice. This man doesn't... Nathan stopped, started again, more carefully. He doesn't resort to overt threats. He doesn't need to. He finds the thing a person needs most and makes it difficult to hold on to it. He finds the relationship that matters most and introduces doubt into it. He's patient, and he's very good at identifying where something is fragile. Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about what was fragile. The building, which was held only by a receipt and goodwill and $60 of administrative processing. The commercial account with Dale, which was a handshake and 60 days of trust. Cora's arrangement, which was a conversation over a kitchen work table and no paper to back it up. Nathan himself, his presence here was voluntary, uncontracted, contingent on nothing she could enforce. I know what's fragile, she said. I also know what isn't. She held his gaze. Start with what isn't. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression did the thing it occasionally did. Shifted, recalibrated, settled into something that was harder to read than his ordinary watchfulness, but felt less guarded. All right, he said. Shasam. The Henderson family, James and his wife Doris, who had run the dry goods west of Frontier Avenue for 14 years, were polite and uncomfortable in equal measure when Elena came to see them Sunday afternoon. They were the kind of people who managed difficulty by managing their reaction to it. Contained, careful, not inclined to say more than they'd decided to say in advance. James had met with Victor on Friday and had come away, as most people did from a first meeting, uncertain whether he'd spoken to an investor or a threat. Doris had come away certain it was a threat, and was waiting for James to arrive at the same conclusion. Elena sat at their kitchen table and did not rush. She asked about their business, how the past year had gone, whether the supply difficulties in the spring had resolved, how their son was settling into the work. She listened, which she was good at, and she let the conversation find the place where their actual concern lived. It was Doris who finally put it plainly. He knew things about our property he shouldn't have known. The mortgage amount, the specific terms. Information that's not generally available. Elena nodded. He's done his research. That's how he works. He comes in already knowing where the pressure points are. How does he get that kind of information? Some of it is county record. Some of it... She paused, because she wanted to be accurate rather than alarmist. Some of it suggests he has a contact somewhere in the local financial network. Someone who's been feeding him information on the businesses he's targeting. The silence that followed had a particular quality. James Henderson's expression did something careful. Walter Grayson uses the same bank we do, he said quietly. Elena looked at him. Yes. And Walter has been in conversation with this man for some time. Yes. She let it sit for a moment. I'm not suggesting Walter is knowingly part of this. I think Walter is as much a target as anyone. But the connection exists. James looked at Doris. Doris looked at her coffee cup, then back at Elena. What are you asking us to do? James said. I'm asking you not to respond to any further communication from Rains or from any company connected to him until you've spoken to a lawyer. I can give you a name, Agnes Fowler in Harlan Creek, who is already working on this. She paused. And I'm asking, when the time comes, for you to stand with the rest of the town. Not yet. Not publicly. Not until we have what we need. But when we do, I need people who will say out loud what happened to them. Doris Henderson looked at her with an expression that was tired and clear in equal measure. You're building a case. Yes. And you're building something else too, Doris said. That building on Frontier Avenue. Yes. Those things are connected. Yes, Elena said. They are. Another silence. Then Doris reached across the table and refilled Elena's coffee without being asked, which was its own kind of answer. Victor found her on Tuesday. She was on her knees in the front room of the Harmon building, fitting a piece of replacement board over the softened section near the back wall, when she heard the front door open. She had left it unlocked. She was usually in and out through the morning, and the lock was new and stiff, and she hadn't yet developed the habit. She looked up. Victor Rains stood in the doorway in his immaculate coat, his hat in his hand in the same gesture Nathan used, though on Victor it looked like calculation rather than courtesy. He looked around the room with the expression of a man taking inventory. Miss Voss, he said, I hope I'm not interrupting. Elena got to her feet. She had sawdust on her knees and a carpenter's pencil behind her ear, and she was aware of all of it and decided none of it mattered. Mr. Rains. He looked at the room, at the new window glass she'd had installed, the repaired floorboards, the work table she'd set up. I understand you've taken the lease here, a bold decision for someone in your position. My position, she said. A woman starting a new venture without substantial capital behind her, in a market that's about to experience some significant changes. He said it pleasantly, the way he said everything, the pleasantness functioning as a kind of atmospheric pressure, making the room feel smaller without anything sharp being said. I have a proposal that might interest you. She waited. I'm in the process of developing a hospitality concept for this corridor, a more unified modern approach to what Blackridge Valley could offer travelers and residents. I'd like a quality food operation as part of that concept. Someone with your reputation. He smiled, the slightly ahead of itself smile. It would be a salaried position, significantly better than what you were earning at the inn, creative control over the menu, a proper kitchen built to your specifications. She looked at him. She understood with complete clarity what this was. He was offering to buy her, not the building, her name, her reputation, the thing that made people trust the food that came out of whatever kitchen she was working in. If she said yes, she became part of his operation, and her credibility traveled with her, and everything she had been building, the network of trust, the knowledge of his documents, the case she was helping construct against him, became inaccessible, either because she was legally bound to him, or because the people who trusted her would no longer know whose side she was on. It was, she thought, the most dangerous thing he had done yet. Not because she was tempted. She was not tempted, not for a second, but because it meant he understood exactly what she was worth. That's a generous offer, she said. I think you'd find it mutually beneficial. I'm sure you do. She picked up the carpenter's pencil from behind her ear, looked at it, set it on the work table. I'm not interested. Victor's expression didn't change much, just a slight recalibration, the same thing she'd seen in Nathan's face, but colder. This building is going to be very difficult to sustain independently. The corridor is going to change significantly in the next several months. It would be a shame to build something and then find it isn't viable. Is that a prediction or a plan? A small pause. Just an observation. Then I'll observe right back, Elena said. The Harmon building lease is filed, it's paid, and it's mine. The county recorder has a copy. My lawyer in Harlan Creek has a copy, and I have a copy in a place that isn't here. She looked at him directly. If the corridor changes in ways that affect my business, I'll adapt. That's what I've been doing my whole life. Victor looked at her for a moment. The pleasant expression was still in place, but the quality of it had changed. Thinner, more surface level, something less comfortable underneath. "I see I misjudged the situation," he said. "Most people do," Elena said. By that evening, and she told him about Victor's visit. He listened with the tight expression he used when he was controlling a strong reaction. "He's spooked," Nathan said. "He came off as controlled." "That's how he comes off. It doesn't mean he isn't spooked." He looked at the documents on the work table. "He came to you directly. He doesn't usually do that. Usually the pressure is more indirect. Something shifted." "Tom Burley's letter lapsed on Saturday," she said. "He didn't respond to it, and the intent expired. Victor would have known by Monday." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's losing his timeline. The loan maturity's in 8 weeks, and he needs the properties locked in before that window closes, or the whole structure falls apart." He looked at her. "He's going to move harder." "I know." She looked at the papers, Victor's documents, Agnes's preliminary notes, the county filings, the copies she had made of Walter's loan agreement. All of it spread across the work table that had been a piece of salvaged shelving 2 weeks ago. "So are we." Nathan sat down across from her at the work table. He pulled the Meridian contract toward him and read it in the focused silence he brought to documents. And Elena worked on her supply list for the restaurant's opening, and the wind came against the new window glass and held there, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It was not uncomfortable, that silence. It was the particular silence of two people who have found a working rhythm and are inside it, and Elena noticed it without examining it too closely, because some things were easier to have than to explain. "The Cascade River registration," she said eventually. "Wednesday," Nathan said. "I'll have it Wednesday."
Thursday to Harlan Creek. Thursday. She went back to her supply list. He went back to the contract. Outside, the wind pushed against the building, and the building held. The Cascade River registration arrived on Wednesday afternoon, as Nathan had said it would, carried by the southbound mail coach in an envelope from a county recorder's office in Coos County, Oregon, that had been stamped, re-stamped, and handled by at least 4 different postal workers, judging by the condition of the paper. Nathan brought it to the Harmon building without opening it, which Elena noticed and respected. He had understood somewhere along the way that this was her operation as much as his, and that opening the document without her felt wrong, even if the practical result would have been identical. They opened it together at the work table. The registration was 3 pages, dense with the administrative language of corporate filing, and it listed the beneficial owner of Cascade River Development as a holding company called Thornfield Partners, registered in Delaware, which told them nothing by itself. But the registered agent for Thornfield Partners, the name on the filing, the legal contact, was the same name that appeared as registered agent for Meridian Capital Holdings in the Oregon filing Nathan had obtained the previous week. 1 name, 2 companies, the same hand behind both doors. Elena read the agent's name twice. Then she copied it onto a separate piece of paper in her careful, precise handwriting and dated it and signed it as a true copy of the document in front of her. Nathan watched her do this without comment, which told her he understood why she was doing it before she said it. "Agnes needs this today," she said. "The Friday coach to Harlan Creek doesn't leave until morning." "I know." She folded the copy. "I'm going to ride it myself tonight." Nathan looked at her. "It's a 3-hour ride in the dark. I've made longer." She pulled her coat off the nail by the door. "You need to stay here. Victor is going to do something in the next 48 hours, and I need someone watching." She could see him weighing it, his instinct to accompany her against the practical reality that one of them needed to be in Blackridge Valley while the other was gone. The calculation took about 4 seconds, which she appreciated because a longer argument would have cost time they didn't have. "Take the bay from the livery stable," he said. "Tell Hector I sent you. She's steadier in the dark than most." Elena was at the door when he said, "Be careful." She looked back at him. The lamp on the work table was behind him, which put his face half in shadow, and she couldn't read his expression with the usual precision. What she could read was the quality of the words, not the routine caution of someone saying "be careful" because it was the thing you said, but something with more weight than that, something that meant it. "Always," she said, and went. Agnes Fowler opened her door at 10:30 at night
with a lamp in her hand and the expression of someone who had learned, over a long career, not to be surprised by late arrivals. She read the Cascade River registration in her sitting room while Elena drank the tea Agnes had insisted on making, and the lamp threw steady light across Agnes's face. And Elena watched the lawyer's expression move through the same sequence hers had. Recognition, assessment, the click of a final piece finding its position. Thornfield Partners, Agnes said. Same registered agent as Meridian. Same agent is not the same as same owner. A registered agent can represent multiple unconnected clients. Agnes set the document down and picked up a different one, something from her own files that Elena hadn't seen. However, she held up the page. The original Meridian filing in Oregon, which Crowell sent me last week. The mailing address for correspondence is a suite in Portland, and the Cascade River filing you just brought me. The mailing address for Thornfield Partners is the same suite number in the same building in Portland. Elena set down her tea. Different company names, Agnes said. Different state registrations. Same physical address. She looked at Elena with the flat precision of someone who has spent 30 years reading between lines. That's not aggressive investment. That's a shell structure designed to obscure a single owner's activity across multiple transactions in the same market, which, depending on how a court reads the intent, looks very much like coordinated fraud. Is that enough? It's enough to file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office and request a hold on any pending property transfers until the ownership structure is examined. Agnes put the documents together in a neat stack. It's also enough to go to Walter Grayson with, which I would suggest doing before filing anything officially. If Walter understands that the man he's been negotiating with has been operating under concealed identities across multiple states, he may choose to cooperate with an investigation rather than be caught up in one. Elena had been thinking about Walter, had been thinking about him since the Henderson kitchen, since Doris had refilled her coffee without being asked, and she'd thought about what it meant to be owed something by the person who had wronged you. Walter had wronged her, clearly, and without much remorse at the time. He had also, she was increasingly convinced, been carefully set up to do so by a man who had identified his weaknesses 14 months before Elena ever became part of the picture. That didn't make Walter innocent. It made him a different kind of problem than Victor. I'll talk to Walter, she said. When does the complaint go to the land office? Give me until Monday. I want it properly written, and I want a colleague in the territorial capital to look at it before it's filed. A poorly constructed complaint gives Victor's lawyers something to pick apart. Agnes looked at her. Monday is still 2 weeks before his loan maturities. We have time to do this correctly. Elena looked at the stack of documents on Agnes's table. The thing they had built together over 9 days of movement and pressure and small decisive acts, each one insufficient alone, together amounting to something real. Monday, she said. Bam. She rode back in the early morning, before the sun was fully up, with the borrowed bay moving steadily beneath her and the cold air working at her face and hands. She thought about Walter. She thought about what she was going to say to him and how, whether to go alone or with Nathan, whether to be blunt or to come at it sideways and let him arrive at the truth himself. She decided on blunt. She had tried sideways for 10 years, and it had kept her safe and invisible, and she was done with both. Blackridge Valley looked the same when she came back into it from the North Road. Same dusty main street, same storefronts, same particular quality of early morning light that sat different out here than it did anywhere else she'd lived. She had not grown up here. She had arrived here at 23 with a carpet bag and a cooking knowledge and no particular plan, and somewhere in the 10 years since, without noticing the moment it happened, the town had become hers in the way a place becomes yours, not because of ownership or birthright, but because of the daily accumulation of being present in it, caring about it, being known, and knowing in return. She went to the Harmon building first. Nathan was there, which she registered with a relief she kept off her face. Tell me, she said. He had been up through the night, which showed in the set of his eyes more than anything else. Not tired exactly, but used, in the way of a man whose stamina was genuinely long but not infinite. He had watched Victor's movements through the previous evening and had 2 things to report. The first was that Victor had sent letters to the Henderson family and to the widow Marsh. Not proposals this time, Formal notices referencing the right of first refusal clause in a loan document that neither the Hendersons nor the widow Marsh had been aware of holding. Elena's stomach turned when she heard this. Victor had apparently taken out secondary loans, smaller amounts, buried in what looked like routine business credit, against both properties without the owners fully understanding what they were signing, which was a different mechanism than Walter's loan, but the same intent, invisible leverage, exercised at the moment of his choosing. The second thing was that Gus Pendleton had quit the inn on Wednesday afternoon. Elena blinked. Gus quit? Walked out midway through the lunch service. Nathan's expression held the faint quality of something he found grimly satisfying but wasn't going to say so. Apparently, the conversation with Walter about the lunch situation 2 weeks ago did not go the way Gus had hoped, and there were further conversations since, and the cumulative effect was that managing the kitchen at the Blackridge Grand Inn turned out to be less glamorous than anticipated. Elena absorbed this. The inn was now without a kitchen manager, which meant Walter was without his primary service operation, and whatever deal he had been negotiating with Victor now had a visible operational crack in it. Walter is going to need someone, she said. He's going to need several people. He's already lost 2 of the serving staff who followed your lead when you left. Nathan looked at her. He's also scared. Whatever he thought he was doing with Victor, reality has started to look different than the plan. This was the moment then. She could feel it. The particular quality of a situation that has reached its point of maximum instability, where the forces in play are shifting fast enough that the right word in the right place could redirect the whole thing. I need to talk to Walter today, she said. Do you want me there? She thought about it. Walter's relationship with her was complicated in the specific way of 2 people where one has wronged the other and both know it. Adding Nathan, a man with a reputation and a visible history of law enforcement, would shift the dynamic in ways she couldn't fully predict. Walter might close up, or he might use Nathan as an excuse to make this about something other than what it was actually about. No, she said. I'll go alone. Watch Rains. Walter Grayson was in his office at 10 in the morning when Elena knocked. He looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting her at some point and was both relieved and dreading that the point had arrived. He looked, she thought, genuinely diminished in a way he hadn't the last time she'd been in this office. The controlled, proprietary energy that had always characterized him, the particular posture of a man who owned things and wanted you to know it, had gone softer, less certain. He was still dressed well, but his desk had the disorder of someone who had been going through papers urgently, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of bad sleep. Elena, he said. Walter. She sat down across from his desk without being invited, which felt significant and right. I need to tell you some things about Victor Rains. He was quiet for a moment. I think I know some of it already. You know that the company he used for your loan is connected to the company he's been using to file purchase inquiries on properties all over this town? The color in his face went slightly uneven. I didn't know that specifically. The loan you took from Meridian Capital Holdings 14 months ago, Meridian and Cascade River Development are the same beneficial owner, same address in Portland, same registered agent. Victor Rains has been building a position in Blackridge Valley for over a year, using your loan as leverage, using the right of first refusal clause you signed to give himself claim over any sale of this inn. Walter's jaw tightened. He told me the loan was a standard commercial arrangement. He tells everyone whatever they need to hear. She kept her voice even. This was not the moment for anger, even though the anger was there. It had been there since the morning he'd walked into her kitchen and told her she wasn't the right image. She had put it where it needed to go and left it there. He's done this in at least 3 other locations. Different company names, same structure. He identifies the pressure point, creates or finds the financial difficulty, offers the solution, and the solution turns out to be a trap. Walter was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his desk, at the disordered papers, which Elena could now see included his copy of the Meridian loan agreement. He's going to take the inn, Walter said. It came out flat, like a man stating a fact he has been avoiding. He's going to try. Whether he succeeds depends on what you do in the next few days. She leaned forward slightly. There is a complaint being filed with the Territorial Land Office on Monday documenting the shell structure and the coordinated nature of his activity across multiple properties. If you cooperate with that complaint, provide your loan documents, your correspondence with Victor, a statement about the terms as he represented them to you, you become a complainant rather than a co-respondent. Walter looked at her. There was something in his expression that she hadn't expected. Not just fear, but something raw. A man confronting the specific shape of how he had been foolish and finding it more uncomfortable than he'd prepared for. And if I don't cooperate? Then the filing goes without your account. And when the structure is examined by the land office, your loan and your negotiations with Victor look like willing participation rather than what they actually were. He was quiet again. Outside the office window, Frontier Avenue was going about its ordinary business. She could hear the distant sounds of it, commerce and movement, and the small noise of a working town. "I should have listened to you," Walter said finally. It came out stiff, the way things come out when a man who doesn't apologize easily tries to approximate one. "When I restructured things in the kitchen, I knew you were the reason the food was what it was. I told myself it was a business decision." Elena looked at him. She let herself feel for exactly one moment the full weight of 10 years of being undervalued and underpaid and taken for granted and publicly diminished. And then she set it aside because this was not the time and also because carrying it wasn't serving her anymore. "It was your decision to make," she said. "I've made mine." Walter looked at the desk. "The restaurant. The Harmon Building." "Yes." "You'll do well." "I know." She stood up. "I need your correspondence with Victor. Everything he sent you, every letter, every proposal document. Copies are fine if you want to keep the originals. I need them by Saturday." Walter nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes, and who was, underneath the specific humiliation of the moment, probably going to be all right because of it. She was almost at the door when he said, "Elena." She turned. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. She looked at him for a moment. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough for 10 years. But it was real, which was more than she had expected, and she gave him the small credit of acknowledging it. "Saturday," she said, and left. But Victor made his move on Friday. It was not the move any of them had anticipated. Not a legal filing, not a letter, not another quiet conversation over dinner. It was more direct than that, and more personal. And Elena understood when she heard about it that he had decided the patient approach had run its course. Nathan found her at the Harmon Building just before noon. He had been watching the telegraph office on the corner of Frontier Avenue since early morning because Victor had sent 2 telegrams the previous day and Nathan wanted to know to whom. What he had learned instead by being present when Victor left the telegraph office that morning was that Victor had immediately gone to Dale Kaufman's Feed and Grain and had told Dale that Elena Voss had been operating illegally as a de facto business manager for the Blackridge Grand Inn for the past decade without proper licensure, and that the county commerce office had the right to examine any commercial credit extended to her business on that basis. Elena sat very still when Nathan told her this. It was, she recognized with the cold clarity of someone who has just been shown exactly how an opponent thinks, a targeted strike. Victor had done what Nathan had warned her about, found the thing she most needed to hold on to, and introduced doubt into it. The commercial account with Dale was the financial backbone of her opening operation. If Dale withdrew it, even temporarily, even just pending a county review, she couldn't open. And if she couldn't open on the date she had announced and the town was expecting, the momentum she had built would begin to erode, and Victor would use that erosion. The claim was false. She had never operated as a licensed business manager. She had been an employee, managing functions that Walter assigned to her, which was completely different. But false claims filed with county offices took time to untangle, and Victor had learned over years of doing this that time was the resource most people ran out of first. She stood up from the work table. "I need to go see Dale," she said. "I'll come." "Yes," she said, which surprised him slightly. She could see it, the small recalibration. She had been going to things alone lately, building the habit of her own sufficiency. But this was different. This time, she wanted a witness. Dale Kaufman was behind his front counter when they walked in. and he had the expression of a man who had been expecting company and wasn't sure which kind. Elena didn't wait for the pleasantries. Victor Raines came to you this morning. He did, Dale said. What did he tell you? Dale looked at her steadily. He was not a man who was easy to read, had the same flat, declarative quality that Tom Burley had, the settled inscrutability of someone who had made most of his important decisions slowly and out loud to nobody. He told me you were subject to a Commerce Office review, that extending credit to your business was a risk I should consider. And I told him I appreciated the information and I'd look into it. Dale's expression didn't change. Then he left. Then I pulled out your credit arrangement and read it again from the beginning. Elena waited. The arrangement is with Elena Voss, private individual, doing business as, he named the restaurant name she had registered, which is a separate legal entity from the Blackridge Grand Inn by every definition I know of. He looked at her. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been running a commercial operation for 22 years, and I know the difference between an employee and a business owner, and you've been an employee up until 6 weeks ago. Whatever you did in that capacity is Walter Grayson's problem, not yours and not mine. Something in Elena's chest released, a tension she had been holding since Nathan had told her, a tight thing she hadn't entirely acknowledged to herself. The account stands? The account stands. Dale looked at Nathan. Your man Raines is going to find that people in this valley don't respond well to being told what to think about someone they've known for 10 years. He picked up a ledger from behind the counter. I've also had 4 people in here this week asking me about your opening. If your food is half what it was at the inn, you're going to need a larger order than you've planned for. Elena looked at him. Double what I put in then, she said. I'll add it to the account. She walked out of Dale's store into the afternoon light on Frontier Avenue and stood for a moment while the relief settled into something more durable. Nathan came out behind her and stood beside her, not saying anything. He miscalculated, she said. He always does eventually, Nathan said. He relies on isolation, on people not comparing notes, not trusting each other enough to share information. When the community already trusts each other, the leverage doesn't work the same way. She looked down the length of Frontier Avenue, at Dale's store, at Margaret's Dry Goods on the East End, at the Henderson shop, at the Widow Marsh's laundry, at the space where the Harmon building sat with its new window glass catching the afternoon light, at the people moving between these places, conducting the ordinary commerce of a town that had been here before Victor arrived and intended to be here after he left. He came here thinking it was a collection of separate targets, she said. He didn't understand it was one thing. No, he never does. Walter's documents arrived Saturday morning, a full package, every letter and proposal Victor had sent him over 14 months, organized by date in the methodical way of a man trying to be useful after a long time of being the opposite. There was a handwritten note on top, brief and without embellishment, that said he had also sent a letter to Agnes Fowler in Harlan Creek directly, which Elena had not asked for, but which meant he had understood the shape of what was being built and had chosen his side without needing to be told twice. She added Walter's package to the collection on the work table and stood back and looked at everything together. The Meridian documents, the Cascade River registration, the registered agent connection, the survey filings, the Henderson secondary loan paperwork, Tom Burley's letter of intent, Walter's 14 months of correspondence. Agnes had Nathan's supporting documents from Oregon. She had Elena's copies of the county filings. She had now Walter's direct account. It was, Elena thought, the story of what Victor had done, told in his own documents. He had written his own case against himself, one careful contract at a time, and they had simply gathered it up. She sent word to Agnes that the Walter package was coming, and Nathan wrote it to Harlan Creek on Sunday morning. Agnes filed the complaint with the Territorial Land Office on Monday, as promised. The complaint requested an immediate administrative hold on any pending property transfers involving Meridian Capital Holdings, Cascade River Development, or Thornfield Partners in Blackridge Valley, pending examination of the beneficial ownership structure and a review of the conditions under which the right of first refusal clauses had been presented to signatories. The administrative hold was granted by Tuesday afternoon. Elena heard about it from Nathan,
who had stayed in Harlan Creek long enough to watch the filing go through and rode back the same day. He came into the Harmon building dusty from the road and set his hat on the work table and said, "It's done." She was in the middle of organizing the kitchen shelving. The back room was nearly ready, the stove had been delivered the previous Friday, and she had spent the morning figuring out exactly where everything went, which was the kind of problem she solved by physical intuition rather than planning. She stopped what she was doing. The hold covers all 3 entities? All 3. Any transfer currently in negotiation is paused until the territorial examiner reviews the structure. He sat down. Victor's lawyers will challenge it. Agnes expects a response within 10 days. But the loan maturities are in 3 weeks, and with the transfers on hold, he can't complete the acquisitions before the maturities trigger, which means his timeline collapses. Elena thought about this, about the particular architecture of what Victor had built, the careful sequence of it, the way each piece depended on the others completing in order. The loan maturities were supposed to create urgency in the sellers. The sales were supposed to close before the maturities triggered costs that Victor's structure couldn't absorb. The whole thing worked on timing, and the hold broke the timing, and without the timing, it was just a pile of aggressive contracts that a territorial examiner was going to look at very carefully. He's going to come after the complaint, she said. His lawyers will say it was filed by interested parties. Yes, Agnes anticipated that. The complaint is filed on behalf of 5 complainants, you, Walter, the Henderson family, the widow Marsh, and Tom Burley, each documenting their specific interaction with the Rains operation. It's not one person's claim. It's a pattern. 5 names. The cook, the innkeeper, the dry goods family, the widow, the rancher. A woman who had been told she wasn't the right image, and the people she had spent 10 years serving honestly, standing together in a territorial land office document. Victor could challenge 1 account, challenging 5, all consistent, all documented, all supported by the same paper trail in his own company's filings. That was a different thing. What does he do now? She said. He has limited options. He can fight the hold and hope the examiner rules quickly in his favor, which is unlikely given the documentation. He can try to negotiate settlements with the individual complainants to get them to withdraw. But Agnes has built the filing so that a single withdrawal doesn't collapse the complaint. The other 4 stand independently. Or he can cut his losses. Which means leaving. Which means leaving, Nathan confirmed. Elena went back to the shelving. She lifted a stack of heavy pots into their positions, testing the shelf weight, adjusting. Her arms were stronger than they had been 2 months ago. All the building work, the physical labor of making a space from nothing, had added something to her that she was aware of in the way you're aware of a change that happens gradually and then presents itself as obvious. He's not going to go quietly, she said. No, but quiet was never the goal. Nathan picked up the last of his documents from the work table. His organ materials, his contact information, the paper trail he had built in parallel with hers. He stacked them neatly. The goal was right. She looked at him. He was looking at the stack of papers, and there was something in his expression that was harder to read than usual. Not the tight watchfulness, not the controlled assessment, but something quieter and without a clear name. You've done this before, she said. Tracked men like Victor. Some version of it. Is it usually this complicated? He thought about it, which she appreciated. He gave the question the honest consideration rather than a quick deflection. Usually people are more isolated, or more afraid. He looked up from the papers. You didn't isolate and you didn't frighten easily. That made it different. Elena looked at him steadily. There was something she had been not examining for several weeks now. A thing she was aware of at the edges of her attention. The way you're aware of a sound at the edge of hearing, present and recurring, but never the thing you were directly attending to. She was 33 years old, and she had spent a decade being careful about what she let herself need. And Nathan Crowell was a complicated man with a complicated history who had shown up in her town and stayed in a way that neither of them had planned or explained. She was not ready to examine it directly, but she let herself be aware of it, which was more than she had allowed herself before. Stay for supper, she said. I'm cooking in the new kitchen for the first time tonight. I need someone to tell me honestly if something's wrong with the stove draw. Nathan looked at the new stove in the back room,
which was a very good stove and very clearly had nothing wrong with its draw. "All right," he said, and cut. Victor Rains left Blackridge Valley on a Wednesday, 12 days after the administrative hold was filed. He did not announce his departure. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He checked out of the inn before breakfast, settled his bill with Walter in cash, and was on the northbound coach before the town's commercial district had fully opened for the day. Nathan found out from the livery stable operator who had returned Victor's hired horse and noticed the speed with which he'd prepared to leave. He came to the Harmon building to tell Elena, who was in the middle of her first full trial service, she had invited 12 people the previous evening, a mix of suppliers and neighbors, and the Hendersons and Cora, to serve a complete meal in the new space and identify everything that still needed fixing before the public opening. Nathan came in just as she was carrying a pot of soup from the kitchen, and she read his expression across the room and understood before he said it. She set the pot down. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, to the table of 12 people who were looking at her, "Victor Rains is gone." The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Dale Kaufman said, "Does that mean we can have the soup now?" And the room laughed, and Elena went back to the kitchen. She stood for a moment over the stove with her hands on the edge of the worktop, feeling the heat from the burners and the specific weight of a thing that had been carried for weeks and was now, without ceremony, put down. It wasn't over. She knew that. Agnes still had work to do with the territorial examiner. The complainants still had to follow through with their statements. Victor's lawyers would still file their challenge. Leaving town was not the same as being finished, but the timeline he'd depended on was broken. The properties he'd been maneuvering for were not his and were not going to be his on his schedule. The structure he'd built over 14 months in Blackridge Valley had been examined, named, and documented in a territorial land office, and the people he had counted on being isolated and afraid had turned out to be neither. Old Cora came into the kitchen behind her and picked up the bread without being asked, because she always knew when something needed to happen next. "Soup's going to get cold," Cora said. "I know," Elena said, and picked up the ladle. The territorial examiner arrived in Blackridge Valley on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Victor Rains had left on the northbound coach, and he was not what Elena had expected. She had prepared herself for someone bureaucratic and slow, the kind of official who moved through paperwork with the careful indifference of a man whose job security depended on never being wrong rather than on being right. What came through the door of Agnes Fowler's temporary office, Agnes had ridden up from Harlan Creek 2 days before to manage the proceedings, was a compact man in his early 50s named Gerald Hatch, who shook hands briefly, sat down, opened his case, and said, "Show me the registered agent connection first." Agnes showed him. He read it without speaking. Then he read it again. "Same suite number," he said. "Same suite number," Agnes confirmed. He looked at the Meridian filing, then the Cascade River filing, then the Thornfield Partners registration. He did this the way Elena read a complicated supply contract, methodically, without hurry, not moving to the next page until the current one had given up everything it had. Then he set the stack down and said, "How many complainants?" 5. All with documented interactions, all with supporting correspondence. I'll need to speak with each of them individually. They're available beginning this afternoon. Hatch looked at Agnes over the top of his reading glasses. "You prepared them." "I prepared them to tell the truth accurately," Agnes said, "which is the only preparation that matters." He almost smiled. "All right. This afternoon." Elena was the first one he spoke to, in the back room of Agnes's temporary office, with Agnes present and a county clerk taking notes in the corner. Hatch asked his questions in the flat, efficient way of someone who had done many of these and knew exactly what he needed and what he didn't. He asked about the Harmon building filing, about Victor's visit to the building, about the offer Victor had made her. He asked her to describe in her own words what Victor had said. She described it. She was precise because precision was what she was good at, and she did not editorialize or add weight to the account. She had learned from watching Agnes work that a clean factual account was more powerful than an emotional one in this kind of setting, because it was harder to dismiss. When she finished, Hatch looked at his notes.
He offered you a salaried position within his development concept. Yes. And you declined. Yes. At which point he made reference to the viability of your business under the coming changes to the corridor. Yes. Hatch wrote something. That's a threat. That's how I understood it. It's also a pattern. He set down his pen. We've seen this company structure before, Miss Voss. Different states, different names. You're not the first community to find themselves inside one of these arrangements. He paused. You're the first one to find their way out this early in the process. Elena looked at him. What happens to the other communities? Hatch was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man deciding how much of his professional assessment to share. They lose property. They spend years in legal arrangements they can't afford to fight. Some of them come back from it, and some of them don't. He picked up his pen again. The ones that come back tend to be the ones where someone paid attention early. She thought about that on her walk back to the Harmon building, about the towns she would never know by name, the business owners and ranchers and shopkeepers who had sat across from Victor Raines in a different dining room, in a different state, and had not had the particular combination of circumstances that Blackridge Valley had. She thought about what it meant that the difference between recovery and ruin could be as thin as one person who noticed something early and decided to do something about what they noticed. It was not a comfortable thing to think about. It didn't resolve neatly into a lesson or a conclusion. It just sat there, with all its weight, and she carried it alongside everything else. Hatch interviewed all 5 complainants over 2 days. He read Victor's correspondence with Walter, the full 14 months of it, and spent an afternoon with Agnes going through the technical legal analysis of the right of first refusal clauses. On the 3rd day, he issued a preliminary finding. The shell structure involving Meridian Capital Holdings, Cascade River Development, and Thornfield Partners constituted, in the examiner's assessment, a coordinated effort to acquire properties through concealed common ownership in violation of territorial commerce statutes. The right of first refusal clauses, taken in aggregate across the 3 loan agreements, demonstrated a pattern of inducement that went beyond standard commercial practice into territory the examiner characterized as predatory. The administrative hold was made permanent pending a full territorial investigation. Any loan agreements connected to the 3 entities were suspended. The right of first refusal clauses were voided as contrary to public interest. Walter's Inn was his, the Hendersons' building was theirs, the Widow Marsh's laundry was hers. Tom Burley's letter of intent had already lapsed and was confirmed as extinguished. And the Harmon building, Elena's building, had never been in legitimate dispute to begin with. Agnes read Elena the key passages from Hatch's finding in the same back room where they had first opened the Cascade River registration together at 10:30 at night. It was a different time of day now, mid-afternoon, sunlight coming through the window at a direct angle, and the room felt different in the daylight, smaller, more ordinary, just a room in a borrowed office building in a small town, nothing cinematic about it. Elena listened to the legal language and understood it and said, when Agnes finished, "What about Victor himself? The investigation does it reach him personally?" "That's the territorial attorney's domain, not the land office's. Hatch will refer the finding. Whether they pursue criminal fraud charges depends on resources, evidence, and how cooperative the Oregon and other state authorities are." Agnes set the document down. "My honest estimate is that he faces civil liability in multiple jurisdictions and significant regulatory scrutiny. Whether that becomes criminal consequences? I don't know. These things take time and they don't always end the way they should." Elena heard this and accepted it, because she had been around long enough to know that justice was not a mechanism that ran cleanly from cause to effect. It was more like a river. It moved in the right direction generally, but it found obstacles, diverted, pooled in unexpected places, occasionally dried up in the stretch you most needed it. You worked with it as it was, rather than as it should be. "It's enough," she said. "What happened here is enough." Agnes looked at her. "You know, most people in your position would be angrier about the uncertainty." "I'm plenty angry," Elena said. "I just know what to do with it. Mad." The restaurant opened on a Saturday in early December, 6 weeks after Elena had taken possession of the building and 4 days after Hatch's preliminary finding. She had not planned for the opening to coincide with the legal resolution. The opening date had been set weeks earlier, based on when the kitchen would be ready and when she could reasonably expect to serve people without something going catastrophically wrong. That it landed when it did was timing rather than design. The morning of the opening, she was in the kitchen at 5, which was an hour earlier than she needed to be, which she knew and did anyway because she had never in her life been able to sleep past 4 on a day when something important was happening. Cora arrived at 6, looked at the state of the prep work Elena had already completed, and said, "You've been here since before the roosters." The bread needed starting. The bread needed starting at 6, same as every day. Cora hung up her coat. "Go take a walk. Come back in 20 minutes. You're going to hover and make me nervous." Elena went for a walk. She walked down Frontier Avenue in the cold December morning, past Dale's Feed and Grain, past Margaret's Dry Goods, past the darkened windows of the inn, which was still operating, still open, running on a reduced staff while Walter figured out what came next. She walked to the end of the avenue and turned and walked back, and she looked at the Harmon building from the outside as she approached it. Someone had hung a small hand-lettered sign in the window. She hadn't done it herself, hadn't asked anyone to do it. She didn't know yet who had. It said the restaurant name and the opening date, and below that, in smaller letters, Elena Voss, proprietor. She stood in front of it in the cold morning and read her own name on the sign for the first time, and felt something move through her that was not triumph and not relief, but something quieter than both. The particular feeling of a thing being exactly what it was supposed to be, arrived at through exactly the work it required, without shortcuts or luck or anyone's grace but her own. She went back inside and helped Cora with the bread. By the time they opened the doors at 11, there were people already waiting outside. Not a crowd. This was a small town, and she was not naive about the realities of a new business. But 14 people in a line that extended past the new window, including Margaret Oakes and her nephew, and Dale Kaufman and Ruth Burley, who had driven in from the North Road specifically. Tom was there too, standing beside Ruth with his hat in his hands, which was as close to formal as Tom Burley got outside of his own property. The first hour was controlled chaos in the way that any first service is controlled chaos. Things that worked perfectly in rehearsal revealed unexpected friction in execution. The ordering system had a gap she hadn't anticipated. The second serving of soup arrived at one table before the first had been cleared, and there was a moment around noon when 3 things were simultaneously wrong, and she had to make fast decisions about which one to fix first and which ones could wait. She fixed them. Not perfectly, but well enough. By the afternoon service, the system had settled into something closer to its intended shape. Cora moved through the kitchen with the unruffled efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and had long since stopped being thrown by the first-day turbulence of a new space. The serving girl Elena had hired, a young woman named Bess who had come to the Harmon building 2 weeks before looking for work and turned out to be quick and observant in a way that would matter, found her rhythm by the second hour. And the food was what it was, which was excellent, because Elena had spent 10 years building toward a standard that she was not willing to compromise on simply because the circumstances were difficult. The venison was right. The soup was right. The bread was what bread was supposed to be, present and substantial and something you were glad to have at a table. She knew it was right because she tasted everything twice, which was habit, and because she could hear the dining room through the pass-through between the kitchen and the serving area, and the dining room had the particular quality of sound that a room has when the people in it are doing the thing you most hoped they would do, which is forget where they are and simply be fed. Nathan came in for the late afternoon service, after the lunch crowd had gone, and before the dinner service began, in the quiet hour that every restaurant has when the kitchen is still but already thinking forward. He sat at the corner table nearest the window, the one she had begun to think of as his, because he had sat there every time he'd come in during the trial service evenings, the same way he had sat in the corner of the inn when she'd first noticed him. Some habits were structural. She brought him coffee without being asked and sat down across from him, which she hadn't done before. There had always been something to do, something that needed attending to, a reason to stay in motion. She sat down. The afternoon light was the low, flat kind of December light that came at an angle and made everything cast a long shadow. "Good opening," Nathan said. "It was rough in the middle. Not from where I was sitting. You weren't in the kitchen." She wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup. She had poured herself one without thinking about it, which was unusual. She almost never sat down in a working kitchen. The pass-through system needs adjustment, and I need to rethink the soup order if we're going to have full lunch services. Nathan looked at her with an expression that she had come to read as his version of amusement. You're cataloging problems on opening day. I'm cataloging problems on opening day so they're fixed by day 3, she said. That's how you build something that lasts. You don't wait for things to feel perfect before you look at what's wrong. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a general philosophy or specifically about restaurants? Both. She looked at him. Why are you still here, Nathan? It came out more directly than she had planned. She had been circling the question for weeks, aware of it at the edge of her attention, and somewhere between the chaos of the lunch service and the stillness of this particular moment, it had come through before she'd decided to say it. He looked at the coffee cup. A long pause, the kind he used when he was deciding to say something accurately rather than conveniently. I've been in a lot of towns, he said. I've done a lot of work that needed doing and then left when it was done. That's been the pattern for a long time. He looked up. I stayed here past when the work was done. I noticed. I know you noticed. He said it without embarrassment, just an acknowledgement. I'm not entirely sure what to do about that. Elena looked at him. This careful, complicated man with his scarred hands and his almost smiles and his 12 years of moving through other people's problems and never staying. She thought about what it meant to build something. She had been thinking about it for weeks, in the context of the restaurant, but it applied beyond that. It applied to every relationship she had allowed herself to have and then held at a careful distance when it got close enough to cost her something. She had spent her whole life being careful about what she needed. She had good reasons. The reasons had served her well. She was also 33 years old and sitting in a room she had built from a derelict building through 6 weeks of work that had taken more out of her than she would admit to most people, and she was tired of conducting her emotional life like a woman preparing for a loss that hadn't happened yet. Stay, she said. Figure out the rest after that. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled, not into certainty because neither of them was there yet, but into something more honest than either of them had managed before. That's a bigger ask than you're making it sound. I know what I'm asking. Another pause. Outside, Frontier Avenue was going about its late afternoon business, and the light through the new window glass was doing what December light does in the late afternoon, going amber and long. All right, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a resolution to anything, not a clean ending to the particular tension that had been building between them for 8 weeks. It was just two people, each of them imperfect and wary and carrying more history than they'd fully disclosed, deciding to keep being in the same place for a while and see what that became, which was, Elena had learned, how most real things started. The territorial investigation into Victor Raines extended into the following spring and reached across 3 states. Agnes Fowler was called as a witness twice and billed her hours at a rate that Elena thought was probably too low, but did not say so, because Agnes had the particular pride of a woman who set her own prices. The civil judgments, when they came, were significant, enough to reach whatever Victor had accumulated across his years of this particular work. Whether it reached all of it, Elena never knew for certain. Agnes said probably not. These things rarely reached all of it. Walter Grayson reopened the inn's dining room in January with a new arrangement, smaller, more honest about what it was, no pretense of grandeur he couldn't sustain. He hired 2 of his former staff back at improved wages. He did not hire Gus Pendleton, whose subsequent career Elena did not follow closely. Walter came into Elena's restaurant on a Tuesday in February for lunch, sat at a regular table rather than requesting anything special, and ate the venison stew and the bread and left a generous tip and said, on his way out, that it was the best thing he'd eaten in months, which she received without comment and with the small, specific satisfaction of a woman who knows the exact value of what she makes and no longer needs anyone else to confirm it. Tom Burley's North Range expansion went through the county bank in the spring. Standard terms, nothing elegant about it, the kind of straightforward borrowing that Victor's world depended on people believing was too slow and old-fashioned. Tom told Elena about it over a Sunday dinner at his table, Ruth beside him,
the preserved peaches open with the satisfied plainness of a man who had done the right thing the slow way and was at peace with it. The Henderson family and the widow Marsh never had to face the secondary loan instruments Victor had issued. Agnes had the claims voided as part of the broader investigation findings, and both families came through the winter without the financial strain that had been building toward them. Margaret Oakes became a regular at the restaurant on Wednesday evenings, always sitting at the same table by the east window, always ordering whatever was freshest that day rather than from the written menu, because she had been getting food from Elena long enough to know that the freshest thing was always worth trusting. Elena hired a second kitchen worker in March, a young man named Pete, who had been washing dishes at the inn and showed the particular combination of speed and attention that Elena had learned to look for, which was not talent exactly, but a kind of organized responsiveness that talent could be built on top of. She paid him fairly from the first day, which she had thought about carefully because she understood, from her own experience, exactly what fair wages meant to someone building a life from the ground up. She thought about this sometimes, about the things she had absorbed from 10 years of being undervalued, about which of those things had made her harder in useful ways, and which of them had just made her harder. It was not a comfortable inventory. She had developed habits of self-sufficiency that were strengths and habits of guardedness that had occasionally kept out things that deserved to be let in. She had learned to be excellent at her work and careful about her needs, and she had carried the costs of that arrangement without fully examining them. She was examining them now. Not all at once. It wasn't that kind of reckoning, the dramatic, sudden kind. It was more gradual than that, the way learning anything real is gradual, through small moments of honesty that accumulate over time into something that changes how you see yourself. What she had learned, in the months since the Harmon building became hers, was that the things she had always believed were separable, work and worth, accomplishment and belonging, building something and being known for having built it, were not as separable as she had told herself. She had thought she could sustain herself on the work alone. She had thought being seen was a luxury she didn't need. She had been wrong about that, not about the work. The work was what it was, essential and real and hers. But the work alone, without the town around it, without Cora in the kitchen and Margaret at the east table and Tom's handshake and Nathan across the work table reading documents in the lamplight, the work alone would not have been enough. She had needed them. She had let herself need them. And the world had not fallen apart. On a Thursday evening in April, after the dinner service had ended and Cora and Bess and Pete had gone home, Elena stood in her kitchen alone. She was not doing anything specific, just standing in the room in the way you stand in a place you've built when you need to feel that it's real. The stove was cooling. She could hear it, the particular sound of metal contracting after a long, hot service. The shelves held their order. The work table was clean. The smell of the evening's cooking was still in the room, warm and specific, the way a kitchen smells when it's been used well. She looked at her hands. They were 33 years old, these hands, and they showed it. The calluses, the small scars, the particular strength that came from years of repetitive work. They were not remarkable to look at. Nobody would have called them elegant, but they had made things. Thousands of meals over a decade that had fed people and given them a reason to come back. They had filed a petition and copied documents and scrubbed a floor on their knees and fitted floorboards and written letters to Agnes Fowler in the middle of the night. They had built this room into a place where people felt fed in more than one way. She had spent years thinking about what she was worth and arriving at numbers that were always a little lower than what was true, lower than what Walter paid her, lower than what the town's appetite for her food suggested, lower than what she would have claimed for someone else doing what she did. That habit of undervaluation ran deep. It had its roots in the early years, in the one-room house, in the experience of being a young woman in a world that had very specific ideas about what young women were supposed to need and want and cost. She was done with that particular arithmetic. Not because the world had changed, she was clear-eyed enough to know that the world had not changed as much as it should have. That there would be other Walter Graysons and other mornings when someone with more power than sense looked at her and saw something replaceable. Those things would happen. She could not prevent them. What she could do, what she had done, what she intended to keep doing, was know exactly what she was worth before anyone else had the chance to offer her a number. Come into every room already in possession of that knowledge, so that no one else's assessment of it could be the one that mattered most. She turned off the last lamp and went to the front of the restaurant and stood for a moment looking out through the new window at Frontier Avenue in the dark. The sign was still there. Elena Voss, proprietor. She could see it from the inside, lit from the street lamp. Her name in reverse from this angle, the letters backward but still readable. Still hers. She thought about something Cora had said on the morning of the opening, when Elena had come back from her walk and found the prep moving along, and Cora at the stove with her characteristic immovable efficiency. Cora had said, without turning around, "You know what I always noticed about you?" Elena had said, "What?" "You always cooked like the food mattered," Cora said. "Even when nobody was paying attention, even when Walter was taking credit, you cooked like it mattered because to you it did, and that's rarer than it sounds." Elena had not known what to say to that, so she had said nothing, and Cora had not pushed it because Cora never pushed things she had already said clearly. But she had thought about it since. About what it meant to do work that mattered because you decided it mattered, independent of whether anyone acknowledged that decision. About how that was both a strength and a kind of loneliness, and how the strength had kept her going, and the loneliness had quietly accumulated until something had shifted and she had stopped bearing it entirely alone. She locked the front door, she put on her coat. She walked out into the April evening, which was cold still, but with something underneath the cold that promised the other thing was coming. The loosening, the green smell, the way the world turns from one thing into another without asking anyone's permission. Nathan was waiting outside. He had taken to doing this, appearing at the end of the evening service, unhurried, without making it something that required discussion. He had his hands in his coat pockets and he was looking at the street. And when she came out, he looked at her instead. The way he always did, with the attention of a man who had learned to be careful about what he looked at and had decided she was worth looking at carefully. "Good service?" he said. "Full house," she said. "The soup was right." "It's always right." "Not always." She fell into step beside him. "Last Tuesday the broth was thin." "You're the only person who noticed." "I noticed. That's enough." They walked down Frontier Avenue together in the April dark, past the buildings that were still standing, still occupied, still doing what they had done before Victor Raines arrived, and would go on doing long after his name had faded from the conversation. Past Dale's feed and grain, past Margaret's, past the inn where a light still burned in the front window. It was not a perfect town. It had never been one. It had the particular flaws of any small community, its gossip and its grudges, its resistance to things that were new, and its occasional failure to protect things that were worth keeping. But it was real, and it was standing, and the people in it had, when the moment required it, been more than what Victor Raines had calculated them to be. That mattered. It was not a small thing. Elena had come here at 23 with a carpet bag and a skill she had built from nothing, looking for a place that could use what she had to offer. She had found it, and she had been underestimated in it, and she had built something in it anyway, and she intended to go on building. She had learned, not from one moment, but from the accumulation of all the moments that make up a life lived with attention, that belonging was not something you found already made. It was not a place you arrived at and recognized as home. It was something you made daily through the small repeated acts of showing up and doing the work and knowing your own name and refusing to let anyone else's failure of imagination become the limit of what you allowed yourself to be. She knew her name. She knew her value. She had signed it to a county lease and hung it in a window and built a kitchen under it, and the town had come to the kitchen and eaten and come back. The frontier was dark around them, and the stars were out, and the night smelled of April and cold earth, and the particular clean smell of a town that had come through something and was still standing. Elena Voss walked through it, knowing exactly who she was, going home.